Well, that's a very large question, but basically what we're seeing now is that the 5 big tech companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, that they're gradually taking over a lot of functions, a lot of roles that the legacy news media used to play. So what we're seeing is that, for instance, Facebook Newsfeed, Google News are taking over the distribution functions of what used to be, done by legacy news companies. So that is, of course, very important, because what you see happening is that those platforms like Google News and Facebook Newsfeed, they debundle and rebundle articles, advertisements, and users. And they put that together, and that's how they become the biggest distributors of news. And that, of course, is a huge change vis-a-vis the situation where just, in every country, each nation, newspapers are producing the news, because Facebook and Google Newsfeed have global functions as news distributors. That's a very difficult question, because they're both dependent on tech companies for their news to spread, for the distribution. And on the other hand, the tech companies are dependent on them for producing the news. So it's this double bind that they're in. They're both dependent, and tech companies are dependent on legacy news companies. That makes the situation so complex. So I think that legacy news companies are so important because they have internalized all the public values that we want from news companies. The tech companies who are the new distributors of the news, they don't have those values internalized in their system. So what we're seeing right now is sort of a clash between the old legacy companies that are, very much in favor of creating news, and the new tech companies who have, who don't consider themselves news companies, but at the same time they're very important. They're actually crucial for the distribution of news. For instance, in the United States, more than 50% of Americans receive their news through Facebook news feeds. So a few companies have become in charge, have become very powerful in controlling what news users get to see. At the same time, they do not assume responsibility for what users get to see. You see, so there's this double bind. Well, the European Union, for one thing, has this supranational power. And I think it's very important that they assume that power because the national legislators are not powerful enough to serve that role. Only supranational governments like the European Union can actually assume, the power to give a real counterweight to the high-tech global companies. So I think they're doing a tremendously important job. Are they powerful enough? Well, that's a good question. We don't know yet. Those clashes between the supranational powers and the big corporations, they have only just begun. And one power that, of course, the global corporations have is that they are so much more powerful in a global economy than even supranational legislators are. News companies also had data, of their news readers. What is different now is that the tech companies don't just have the data of news readers, but at the same time that they're distributing news, they're also advertisers. And by connecting, news and advertisers and users, and moreover, they have, like Google has 50 different platforms, not just relating to news companies, but also to, they have so many different platforms, from Google Scholar to driverless cars. They're into, the development of so many different sectors. By combining all those data, all those user data, they become a lot more powerful than just one company in one sector. And that, I think, is a new phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that legislators are not, still equipped to handle. So that is something we really need to look into. Well, that's also a very good question, because when news companies, of course they need to take into account who is reading the news, who is watching the news. So they need to be audience oriented. On the other hand, when they define what news is solely on the basis of what users want, they really have a problem, because they're no longer producing the news that needs to be produced because what's happening in the world based on journalistic values, but they take audience related issues as a basis for producing journalism. And that of course has always been a tension in a society where news is a commercial good. We have always looked at what works well with users. Now in the internet world, this looking at audiences and providing to audience what they really want has become a huge issue, because it's not just that you're an editor and you look at what your readers want, but it's automated, it's outsourced through algorithms to know what readers want. And if that becomes your prime reason for producing news, well, you may wonder whether that is really news. So journalistic values and audience values are two different things, and I think it's the job of professional journalists to balance those two different sets of values. So to look at what users want alone is not enough to produce news. You have to look at what society needs in order to produce good news. Well, your answer is already in your question. They have tremendous power, and not just locally, not just nationally, but globally. So what we have seen in elections over the past year was indeed that global internet companies have been able either to influence, to affect the distribution of news or the production of news. Think about the production of fake news, which was a huge issue in December after the American elections. Once national entities like news corporations, like governments, no longer have control over what news affects their people, we're really having a global problem, because then you can no longer control what is happening in a country or in a certain region. So we really need to look into this. The power of global tech companies has become very substantial, and not just in America, where most of them are produced and producing, but all across the